So we're gonna go on and start with our first panel, which is a roundtable. It's gonna be quite queer in both the content and its form. And I asked Lynne Joyrich to join us for this roundtable, and we have Julia Himberg on Skype. So please help me in welcoming Lynne Joyrich and Julia Himberg. Yes, you can see. So the roundtable also includes another speaker who originally was going to be here but is not. It's Jack Halberstam, who was trapped in Italy for some reason. So he's not going to be here, but Joël went to New York and filmed him. So we're going to have some video clips that are going to help us animate the debate.
Julia, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Hi, Julia.
Hi, Lynn.
All right, so yes, I went to New York because 2 days before I submitted the second grant application to fund this this conference, Jack emailed me being like, I'm sorry, I kind of messed up with my schedule and I have a choice between Venice and Montreal, and I choose Venice, which I guess makes sense. But I flew to meet him in New York, and we had a very nice encounter. So we're gonna play some clips of that later on. All right. So Lynne Joyrich is professor of modern culture and media at Brown University, where she teaches courses in film and television studies, gender and sexuality studies, and cultural and critical theory. She has affiliations as well with the American Studies, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Theater and Performance Studies. She is co-editor of the journal Camera Obscura and the author of Reviewing Reception, Television, Gender, and Postmodern Culture. Her pieces on film, television, convergent media, feminist theory, and queer theory have appeared in such journals as Critical Inquiry, Cinema Journal, which is going to be, I think, a very important one for us today, Differences, Discourse, Journal of E-Media, and so on. She is currently working on a book. Is that right? No.
Yes, I hope.
On epistemologies of gender and sexuality in US TV. Julia Himberg is Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at Arizona State University, so it's very early for Julia to be with us this morning. Her book, The New Gay for Pay, The Sexual Politics of American Television Production, examinizes the role of television production in creating and challenging popular notions about LGBTQ identities and social change in the US. Her work has appeared in journals such as Television and New Media, Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Communication, Culture and Critique, among others. She also does media advocacy for GLANS and LGBTQ organization which work for Safe School and K-12 education. Jack Halberstam is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Gender, Sexuality, Gender Studies, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. No, he's not anymore. He's at Columbia University. So that is a very old bio. But he is the author of very important books such as Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, and has written articles about unbuilding gender lately. Yes. Okay. Huh? Okay, so we are going to start with our first question that is going to introduce, I think, the overall questions that we have been discussing in our introduction.
So I guess this conference is strongly inspired by your Cinema Journal article that you co-wrote in 2014, and whose title was Queer Television Studies, Currents, Flows, and Mainstreams, in which queer and television are considered as two concepts that together create a paradox, what you call a paradox. So can you tell us about this paradox and maybe what has changed today, some years after your article, since the first publication? So what is this paradox of queer and television?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Julia because Julia was the one who actually invited me to that Cinema Journal Roundtable a piece where then I wrote that piece. So what I was trying to get at was, again, the way that televisuality, again, is in some ways very paradoxical. Maybe let me back up. One of the things that my own work most focuses on, I would say, is the construction of knowledge through television. So I'm very interested in the way in which television gives us literally ways of thinking. And I would say that, we are so fully in a televisual culture that people in some ways talk about TV as sort of, is TV dead? Whereas I would say, no, TV is not dead. TV is so enveloping around us that we don't even see how everything is incredibly televisual. And I think that television has a kind of particular logic to it that I see already as a very paradoxical sort of logic. So that the way from what I've been interested in is the way in which television is located sort of exactly at the boundaries and crosses over the boundaries of things that are the categories through which we think that TV is both constantly erecting for us, but also undermining. So that the way that television crosses between the domestic and the social, the personal and the political, the inside and the outside, the sort of everyday banal and the kind of exceptional strange, so that it's both, kind of giving us all these kind of shocking moments, but then absorbing the shocking moments. So it's exactly at all these sort of boundaries, right? The ordinary, the extraordinary. And what I talked about in some of my earlier work, like my work on what I called the epistemology of the console, which obviously was deeply embedded to Eve Sedgwick's concept of the epistemology of the closet, was, again, those are the very categories through which we think, but TV is so much around us that we don't even see how we're thinking through its logic. But that particular logic means, I argued within that there can never be something like, quote unquote, full disclosure in TV, because it obscures as much as it makes obvious. Again, it's kind of on those paradoxes. So it's very much constructs sexuality as this thing that we want to know and we feel like we need to know, and it kind of draws us in, but at the same time, it has to sort of rein in it and tame it. So I was sort of arguing that it's always in a way constructing a sort of closet logic. But the equal flip side to that, you could say, is that it's also always constructing a queer logic, because there are always then precisely because it crosses these categories, right, and totally confuses them, and I would argue really changes, again, the way we make sense of the world. So that equally, I think you could say that there's always, in a way, this sort of queerness within the televisual, through these sort of category crossings, through the slippages, through the paradoxes. And one of the paradoxes I talked about, again, had to do with the way that television is both very much constructs itself as sort of the mainstream, to the point where, again, it seems like even the study of it, it's sort of not as revered as film, it's not as sexy as digital, it's just the sort of boring mainstream. So it's always sort of the mainstream. And on the other hand, through, as you guys were saying, it's all, like, I loved your intro, that it's always too much, there's always more, there's always these sort of alternate narratives, there's always these crazy sort of intersections, only more as it keeps going, as there's convergences. But I would argue from like the early days of TV, I know one of the questions you told us in advance, you asked about the origins, which I can say something more about later, but I feel like that means that television, again, is always in a way the mainstream and kind of messes up the mainstream or shifts it. And again, I don't want to keep blabbing because I want to hear what the brilliant Julia has to say. But, at some point, too, I would maybe want to tie that to, again, I think that the way that it's also impacting current politics through constructing a different kind of logic. But I'll say more about that later.
Julia, would you like?
Yeah, thank you both to Marta and Joelle for organizing this and doing such a splendid job. I'm sorry I can't be there with you all. And yeah, I want to sort of echo a bit of what Lynn was talking about in terms of the pervasiveness of television today, and how much a part of culture it is without most of us even, many being aware of it. I would also say that I think, a lot of my work, I think at first appears very mainstream, right? And dealing with a lot of what is both categorized as and criticized as normative. And what I think I always shift, or I would say, I like to look at both kind of modes and means of production, right? And to look at the result of production and consumption, but also at the way that power reproduces, which happens within institutions, right? So kind of the TV industry defined very broadly. And also thinking about the way, what I've been sort of fascinated by, especially given that, we kind of have this culture with, say, Ellen DeGeneres, right, as a television personality who is also kind of making culture. She's an arbiter, right, of who is allowed to speak. So she's sort of this fascinating figure, I think, right now that represents a lot of the logics happening. And I also just wanted to add that I think, much of TV's history, especially in the United States, has also gone hand in hand with the history of advocacy. And so with those two things, there's a surprising amount of these kind of various configurations of normativity and non-normativity happening in what appear to be very capitalist, right, driven by the bottom line and profit, and yet a surprising amount of room for both activism and for sort of queerness, both on screen and behind the camera as well. So I think I'll leave it there for right now.
We haven't decided how we were going to play the clips with Jack, so I think we could. Have you watched them, or did you watch them? Yeah. I think I'm gonna play maybe the first clip about the origins of queer television, and then we can jump on this and maybe discuss your inputs as well.
Yeah. Okay. I do have to say that I love the mix of sort of a person in person, a person sort of live but on screen, and then Jack not exactly live and on screen, because I feel like that is such queer temporality and spatiality. And again, exactly this thing about TV also being on the border, as we see even here, between the live and the not live, right? And how that creates a sense of either real or not quite real. So it's fabulous. I love what you guys are doing.
It's been a lot of improvisation. It's like, okay, everything is falling apart. What do we do? But it's working. All right, so we're going to watch the first clip. Also, it's not yet edited as a film, or I think it's going to be at some point, but you will see some jump cuts, like it's part of the thing. It's not, we know.
The platform within which queer and trans lives have been represented has always been really important. And so you'll notice, like going back to the 1990s, that if you think about a book like Alex Juhas's AIDS TV, there was an amazing confluence between the AIDS crisis and the handheld camera. And for that reason, there were multiple documentaries of the activism associated with the AIDS crisis that has allowed then in later years for films, but also on the spot for materials to circulate about the kinds of political action that people were taking in response to an indifferent government and around this health crisis. So I think going back some 20, 30 years, we can see that the platform for representation has made massive has had massive implications for the way in which queer and trans lives are represented. So queer television has become a thing even as television has become a thing. And if you think back, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, it seemed like television was going into a decline. Netflix was primarily a service to deliver movies to people's homes, and it seemed like the big shift was going to be that people were not going to any longer go to cinemas. They were going to just stay home and watch kind of pre-selected product. And then along came, for this new platform, along came a completely brand new and revitalized TV. And this has obviously, as this conference I'm sure is going to address in many, many different forms, this has good and bad implications for the representation of queer and trans bodies.
I think what's interesting here is also the idea of platforms, the idea of the ever constantly mutating forms of television.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I know in advance you said, oh, here are some of the things we might talk about, and one of them was the origins of queer TV, which is an interesting question, partially because I think every term within it we could put into question, like what do we mean by origins, what do we mean by queer, and what do we mean by TV, right? So I think that, of course, with queers, we all know that, it just people use it to talk about particular groups of people and identifications and subjectivities and communities and sexualities, but of course people also use it to talk about just in a more general way, operations of sort of subversion and again, paradox or slippages. And in a way, I think it's useful that there is the slippage even between those. I would sort of not want to lose, I wouldn't want to have to choose one or the other. I think that it's how they come together that's interesting. With TV too, it's not so clear what that is. Right, so it's very funny, like when I teach television studies courses every single semester at my university, and I always find it so funny that when I start the semester, every student says to me, oh, we don't watch TV anymore, nobody watches TV, nobody watches TV anymore, and then every single program I mention, from whether like origins of TV to the latest, they've seen everything, but they don't call it television. So what television itself is I think, sort of fascinating. I mean, even from the early days of television, there were a lot of experiments about what TV could be. Two-way television, dialogic, more on the model of the telephone, or big public screenings on the model of cinema. And then, through, as Julie, I'm sure can elaborate, industrial and the funding, the finances behind it through, TV research really being funded by the broadcast radio industry and by the military. Certain uses of television and video became dominant, installed in the home as a domestic technology, right, or else used for surveillance purposes, so that we think of that as TV. But again, TV was always more than that, and even in that sort of installing it in the home, that seems to be the most sort of normative, the way that then it was used to sort of produce a sense of, what is the white middle-class suburban home supposed to be? How do you arrange space? How do you create a routine across the day that's timed to certain things? How do you address the family, that everything was sort of addressed to the family audience and advertised? Again, it seems like the most normative, but even at the time, there were, as Julie said, very early, activist interventions into television, community television, public access television, public televisions, different, uses of video that always made it not exactly equal to that, and, TV in public spaces. So it's always, I think, been more than that. And so again, when we talk about the origins of TV, it depends on what you count TV as. So for me, I think of, again, the televisual on a larger frame and almost a mode of thinking. I do have more I want to say about the origins of queer TV specifically, but want to hear what Julia has to say before I keep blabbing.
I want you laughing. Yeah, I think that piece about kind of 1950s television, the installation into the home, combined with kind of the socioeconomic, political context of the time, right, in terms of post-war history, right, but combined with this economic boom, and then these ideas that we've learned in TV history classes, and that we teach in TV history, about that kind of reproduction of these dominant ideologies and how essential that was to those television shows, both that came over from radio as well as newer shows. And what I've always been fascinated by is how that history has been dominant both in the classroom and in a lot of writing, right, and a lot of research. And yet I'm sort of fascinated as I continue to teach TV as well. My experience has been a little different, which may just be the nature of the institutions, which is, over the years I've seen how I've been able to mention a show and there's some recognition or awareness of it. And as I've, in the last, I'd say maybe 3 to 5 years, that's much less so. And today, in this last semester, when I taught, I noticed how drastic it was, where even what I thought of as a very popular, say, Netflix show, or even a sitcom that had been on for 10 years or so, very few people had seen the same show. So I was kind of amazed by, we hear about peak TV, we know this stuff, and yet I'm just continue to be struck by not only what does television mean today, but also a bit about kind of what does it mean for thinking about both kind of a queer reading and also for thinking about the work that people are doing, especially kind of openly queer television workers are doing in a time when there's so much not just sort of segmentation, but sort of what is the significance then of sort of the idea of, community and of sort of social reflection and refraction from television when so many people now are watching so many different things, it seems, there's always the show that seemed to catch fire, but when I actually take that into a classroom of 40 people, the diversity is pretty astounding to me. So I find that a really interesting place to then think back in terms of kind of the origins of both kind of queer TV and sort of how things have changed from so much of that model in a way, and yet, of course, we see many similarities as well. But I just was struck by that also because, Lynn, you had mentioned how much they do actually know television in a certain sense.
Yeah.
So.
It's interesting. In a way, I think both are true. I feel like with maybe my students just watch more TV, but I feel like they have heard of or seen one episode of like every show, but they don't necessarily watch them all or really know the historical ones. So you're right. There is a big difference back when, in country, where there was 3 channels, 1 channel, and everybody watched the same thing to some degree. Of course, there were always fringe time slots and fringe audiences. And like I said, there were always other experiments. But it is interesting that there was a way in which television, again, was so intertwined, I think, with the sort of setup of domestic space and domestic routine, and constructed a familial that then broadened out in multiple different nations to be a kind of national family. The national family equals the TV family equals the viewing, quote unquote, public, as there was this sort of, but I think, again, from the very beginning, there were also, however much we have to see how TV constructed these very heteronormative notions of living, it was never always that, right? So that even though, again, with TV and the family, for instance, where it's so much like we're invited into their families, they're invited into our living rooms, into our families. They address us as part of the, from our family to yours, they say at the holidays. And there's this, and all the advertisements are around that. There were always, even from the very early days, Burns and Allen's show, where George would literally like step outside of familial space and comment on it and then step back in. Or I Love Lucy, that set the model for the, where Lucy's always trying to, in a way, escape from familial space. She never quite does, but so that there were always these sort of in and out of that made it more complex. So one of the, again, to go back to origins of TV, when I was thinking about that, one of the things I always find so fascinating is what I call the logic of the historical first, like why we even want a logic of the historical first, to be able to say like, this was the first gay person on TV, or this is the first queer TV show, or this was the first lesbian kiss, or whatever. There's like endless, and not only around queer issues. I mean, people also do that with like, what was the first reality show? What, was it, or what was, so that there's always these moments to try to kind of mark the first in a way that I think television, with its temporality of looking both backward and forward in time, complicates. And one of the examples that occurred to me that's mentioned, I think, often within these discourses of historical first, which I understand the desire to want to name and claim certain moments. But again, I feel like TV, through its seriality, in a way makes it impossible to just isolate a moment, right? Because it's both putting things out there and then endlessly they're complicating or undoing it or redoing it or rebooting it, or, But one of the contenders that's often mentioned for sort of first queer TV, as well as often first reality show, is the, I don't know if people have seen it, the US PBS series An American Family, where people talk about this first moment in TV where the first time somebody came out on television, when Lance Loud came out on television. And I was just teaching it again this semester, and it's fascinating because when students see it, I don't know how many people have seen it, but when Lance Loud first comes out on television, he doesn't say, I'm gay, right? Or he doesn't say, here's my boyfriend. What he does is he says, I'm moving to the Chelsea Hotel. That's the moment of coming out. And then he invites his mother to come visit him at the Chelsea Hotel, where she meets, members of the queer community who are never named as such. They're just, this is Lance's community. And in a way, my students were kind of disappointed, like, this is the first coming out, like, he never says I'm gay, and I try to say, like, it's an intervention into what even counted, again, as family, that he's sort of saying, I'm moving from this family to another, sort of queer familial, but I'm inviting you in, Mom, and you get to meet all my friends. And it's a sort of construction of queerness, not necessarily just in terms of individual identity, but as literally a queer space, a queer culture. And it sort of plays then with that familial. He has sort of, so I feel like that TV can do something interesting around that. And again, for all that TV is so tied to the familial, it endlessly extends it, right? So that there's not only the sort of, all the shows about nuclear families, but there's the family of that, family of coworkers, the family of friends, the Happy News family, everything becomes sort of familial to the point where it becomes so extended that television was sort of, I think, the first place where there was a notion of a kind of extended family of choice, which then later politics picked up and sort of made that a queer demand, that we should recognize families of choices. Now, does this mean that TV turns everything into the most sort of heteronormative structure? Or does it mean that it messes with that structure because family on TV means anything, right? So in a way, I think, again, it's always both. It's kind of always normatizing in a way, but it opens up these queer possibilities, like through that moment of An American Family.
So I think that the idea of quantity, it's very interesting that you both bring up the idea of that we have too much, and that brings up the idea, the problem of visibility, because what if everything is possible, we can show everything, but nobody sees it because there's too much, too many platforms, too many venues, too many screens. So maybe maybe what is important to, of course, it has always been for TV, is the discourse that goes with, that is created in the gaps within seasons, within episodes, the idea of what make things visible, actually, also in addition to the fact that it goes on screen, it's broadcasted, or it's available on Netflix, etc. So, and that also brings up the idea of what is good and what is bad, that compared to the idea of the heteronormative family, is of course something that is changing in society, maybe quite slowly. And then also, what is television across countries? What is acceptable here? What is acceptable somewhere else? So the idea of quantity again, of what is acceptable, what is visible, and so what can we say about the fact that people or our students go for good representation of a gay character? We want to work on this because here we can see that gay persons are well represented. So what is this idea of a judgment on the, but yeah, and can we go beyond this opposition between good and bad representations?
Yeah. So I'm happy to jump in, but Julie, do you want to start this time, or do you?
Sure. Yeah, you're bringing up so many good issues that raise the stakes, and I think also just bring up so much of what both the legacy of queerness is, and also how are we thinking about today's kind of television landscape. And one thing I had been thinking a little bit, because of that notion that it seems there's a lot of different queer content, and yet not necessarily a sense of, so many people are watching so many different things. And the idea of sort of good and bad, right, that's so problematic, and also remains so pressingly relevant to people, right? Like both in terms of when I, ask my students to do an analysis in a class that I teach called LGBTV, every semester I'm pushing against their desire to evaluate good and bad, and to try to, have a conversation about the subjectivity involved in that. And yet the fact that it just, it's so strong, and such both a strong, I think, a political urge. I don't think it's naive, actually. I think it's a really strong political urge, but and they seem to, I think what's considered bad is more standard. I think what's good is probably more debated. And I think I'm seeing this a lot with the amount of press attention and awareness of queer baiting, right? We're seeing the press follow this kind of across popular culture. And I notice students too, very reactive to that idea, right? And is seeing that as sort of highly negative, exploitative, something that's pure marketing, and the ways that these shows are trying to, to kind of use industry language, kind of break through the clutter, right? A little bit off in a different direction, though. I also, I always come back to kind of we think of often still, I think of TV as this kind of monolith, these 6, mega, corporations that own everything, and not so much room for day-to-day, in a sort of individual level change, or even kind of small group change. And something that I was really struck by in the interviews that I've done over the years is how much is going on both behind the scenes and kind of under the radar, but strategically under the radar, right? In a way that they don't want the public to know, and that actually becomes far more transgressive because it's kept hidden. And I kind of think about this as a sort of television industrial closet, right, with these individuals that in some way brings up all those questions of shame, right, and all these sort of associations with the closet. And yet, I think there's a tremendous amount of power being wielded that both meets certain demands within the industry, right, for profit and popularity, but also that is remarkably queer in what it is doing, and on the part of those doing it very strategically and effectively.
Yeah, no, I think that that's great points. I mean, I feel like, to go to, again, this issue of good or bad, as Julie was saying, there is always this sort of return to that again, I think we always want to question, because of course it's too simple, but and again, I think that, as I was saying, that TV always in a way is re-erecting these problematic binaries, even as it fully undermines them, and that then keeps it as a pressing question. It like hooks us in to try to figure it out. So, but television, again, as you were saying, is so much in a way more than what we think of as the quote unquote messages of good or bad, that it's an entire sort of televisual construction. So I think that there's really important work being done, like by Julia, about things that are not just sort of representations, but about the industrial constructions behind them and different kinds of production cultures and how things get made. There's also, I think, more, what I try to do is, like I said, look at the sort of overarching logic that I think incorporates the good or bad, or produces that even as an issue, to try to think about, again, how is TV even giving us ways of thinking, and why do we come back to certain ways of thinking, where I think it's again confusing these things even as it pulls them apart. But I think that, again, I do think it's when you were saying like it changing, but maybe not that fast, I think that things change are actually the logics of our culture sort of emerging of multiple cultures from televisuality change quickly, but in ways that I don't think are easy to mark as good or bad. So one example, and these are tying together two things I'm working on that I think seem like incredibly opposed, but I sort of want to bring them together, which is my work on sort of queer television, and again, both kind of the logics of the closet, but also the logics of queerness through TV. And then also in the US, the sort of horrifying phenomena of TV in the age of Trump, or Trump as TV. I mean, now, of course, in the US, we basically are living within a horrific reality television program that operates exactly like a reality program, right? So that I feel like, Trump very early on, as soon as I knew he was going to win, back when everybody was like, there's no way this person will even get a nomination, let alone win, but he was playing it so perfectly according to a televisual logic that it was clear he's going to win. Okay, what do these things have to do with each other? In some ways they seem, and one, the kind of horrible Trumpian TV world seems obviously to be operating at the detriment of queer people, but in some ways it's that same logic. It takes that same logic but does something horrific with it in some ways, right? That if queer theory itself was arguing, okay, there isn't really a distinction between the real and the phantasmatic, the authentic and the performative, that one in fact becomes authentic through their performative. That's exactly the model of what a television reality personality does to mark authenticity, so that we live in a world where even what we mean by authentic or real or true is different. So I think that people who dislike sort of these politics will say, how can anybody, we live in a world now where like there's quote unquote fake news all the time, and there's these endless lies, and we can't believe anything anymore. And then on the other hand, there are people like Trump supporters who will say he's the most honest president there's ever been. And because it's a different meaning of what honest is, or what real is, or what authentic is. It's like it's real because you feel it. It like matches it's the authenticity that matches the performative. It doesn't have to match material reality. That's not our logic anymore of material, right? That it's now this logic of, again, how does the performative become real? Or, he is true to his persona or brand, and that makes it authentic. So in a way, that is also the slippages of the binaries, but here we're caught in those slippages in some horrible double bind that means that it's used against marginalized people. So I would say what we all need to do is kind of try to, instead of just adjudicating what's a good representation or a bad representation, try to step back and think about the overall construction and how that is being used now to like pinch, control, again, not only queer folks, but any, marginalized populations, and think about how can we engage with this new logic. We can't just keep fighting back and saying, oh, but it's not real, because we're already in a different structure than that. So instead, we need to be able to think, how can we ourselves make use of this mode of thinking to engage in it ourselves to be able to then negotiate with it better?
I teach a class about film, gender, and sexuality every semester. And this winter, for the first time in 7 years, a student who I think is gay, actually, told me apparently the AIDS crisis is fake news. And this was a very interesting moment for me because it makes sense with the slippage. We are currently living in this weird moment where nothing is real anymore, and everything's still visualized, and we don't know how to read TV. We don't know how to read media anymore. We lost the sense of reading, which is also very alarming.
I think that that's a great point, because the issue is about reading, right? I don't think our move back can be to say, oh, but this is really real. I mean, and people, it's so interesting the way people even talk about TV, like when people watch reality shows, for example, and because we don't have the words for this yet, we don't have terms for our epistemology, so people will be forced to say like, oh, well, this is real, but that moment was the really real part of the really real, or this was like the not really real, like it was, authentic, but not really real. So like when we say like, when we're resort to having to say like the really real, the not so really real, and I feel like, because again, we have to develop a language for that. I don't think our answer can just be like, just the facts, ma'am, right, to like quote from Dragnet. Because again, I feel like then that ends up, we don't want a situation where we have to pin people to an identity, let's say, but we also, of course, want to take into account sort of material, material situations. So how do we think about that? And again, I think that TV has really sort of shifted what we even mean by these terms, but we're all playing catch up to find a way to figure out how to describe that so that people can think of the best ways of intervening in that. But I don't think it's about just identifying certain content, like this is good content and this is bad content. It has to do, as you said, with how one reads it, which has to do with what community you're in, what you're reading it with and against, what, the multiple kind of intersections of all the different media and communities you're engaging with, but, to try to find ways to intervene in that.
I think we're going to play it's a longer clip of Halberstam's interview on queer possibilities, and I think we could actually move from, because I think it's a very interesting, concrete analysis of what we can actually do with transparent analysis, if that's okay. Yeah? Okay.
Television can do something that film can't do right now because it has time. And in fact, people get deeply addicted to a series, and that form of addiction is in many ways goes back to early industrial capitalism, really, that was pioneered really in the 19th century, was designed literally to seduce readership. The question was, what are the advantages? And like these earlier serialized fictions, the advantage is that you can tell much more complicated stories slowly and in a way where the character development has room to not just give you good or bad versions of any given character. Best example of this that I think we should talk about in a moment is Transparent, where independent director, Jill Soloway, who had not had tons of success either in Hollywood or in TV, was able to pilot a show that became both representative of and trailblazing in relationship to new forms of televisual representation. Is it the case that then a queer-produced series like Transparent, as opposed to a very straight series like Billions, where there are multiple queer and trans characters, is it the case that there's a different distribution of ethics? Is there a different moral structure to that universe? And I think the answer is yes and no. Whereas Transparent, I think, is a much more complicated experience because it does cover a lot of ground that an urban queer or trans viewer might find fairly urgent, fairly authentic, and it deals with storylines that actually we're quite interested in. Also, there are no impossibly good characters and no impossibly bad characters, and it's such a relief, therefore, to be in a TV world where people do bad things for bad reasons sometimes and good things for good reasons. So Moira, the Moira character played by Jeffrey Tambor, not in the last season where they go to Israel, which is a kind of a shit show season, but the season before that, I believe, Tambor's character is confronting the fact that it's confronting something that many trans people have to confront, but that is almost never represented on film, which is that the mechanisms, the medicinal and surgical mechanisms by which people can change their appearance and change their embodiment so that they can pass easily and live as their chosen gender don't work for everybody. And Tambor's character Moira has to confront the fact that I think bottom surgery isn't going to work for her for various reasons. And I know of many people for whom hormone therapy doesn't work either. And so the confrontation with the fact that this magic bullet of surgery plus hormones isn't available to everyone is huge. I mean, that's already, for me, a massive step in the right direction, which is that not every trans person will be able to pass, and therefore you do end up with a very baggy middle ground of people who have had maybe some surgeries but no hormones, or maybe take hormones but haven't had surgeries, or do no hormones and no surgeries and are still claiming their status as transgender. Now the TV, or the visual medium in particular, has a hard time with that because it wants the trans person to either pass or not pass. And if you don't pass, then every shot is sort of about the fact that you don't pass. But if you do pass, then there's a tendency, as the narrative goes on, to sort of forget the transness of somebody. It can fall away very easily. So the visual medium is, in so many ways, a very, very difficult medium for the representation of all kinds of trans experiences, okay? So the indeterminacy of many, many trans people basically means that they cannot appear or disappear in the context of the visual regime within which we all appear and disappear. So I happen to think that one kind of feature of Transparent is super, super important as a televisual strategy in relationship to the representation of transambiguation, okay? And then finally on that, Moira, in that same season, there's a nice set of references to how privileged she is. And this is important because up until then, the series has just sort of presented Moira as, struggling on the horns of a dilemma and struggling with her family and struggling with her identity and struggling with her embodiment. But there's a switch in the series because it's a long series and because we're in now the third or the fourth season already. And so now you need more material that comes closer to the way in which people actually live lives that are difficult and easy in all kinds of unpredictable ways. One of the best sequences in Transparent is when Moira and her two daughters both of whom move in and out of lesbianism over the course of the show, neither one of whom is simply lesbian, go to Michigan Women's Music Festival. And this could have been a disaster, right? Because Michigan Women's Music Festival is one of the most polarizing sites for the conflict that has emerged between trans-exclusionary radical feminists and trans feminists. And I actually thought that what was great about, I think there were maybe 2 shows that dealt with Michigan. What was great about it was that Soloway used the time that TV allows to have her characters unfold a debate about Michigan and present a bunch of different opinions, which doesn't resolve anything, because in the end, Moira feels completely unwelcome and if not kicked out. And when she hears someone shouting "man on the land," you know, she leaves and she's furious, she's disappointed, she feels wretched, and she feels as if the place that she went to find community is just yet another place where she finds that she does not belong. But what's brilliant then about the next sequence is that Soloway then uses the televisual medium to again rescue Moira from her own alienation. And she's picked up by Angelica Houston's character, who is a straight woman who wanted to be at Michigan, but found herself alienated in all kinds of ways as maybe a straight woman who's going to be accused of sleeping with the enemy or whatever. And weirdly, their sexual predilections and their bodily morphologies work, because Moira is a pre-op trans woman and Angelica Houston's character is an alternative straight woman, and therefore their bodies sort of match, and you get an incredible sex scene that's definitely a one-of-a-kind on TV or in cinema, because it's a trans woman with a male body having sex with a straight woman who doesn't really want to be with a man. And and then it reminds you of the kaleidoscopic reality of our desires and our gendered bodies. And more importantly, it reminds us that for people who do feel deeply alienated, often by their trans embodiment and their sense that they have fallen out of multiple social orders, sometimes sex can be a way that trans bodies are pulled back pleasurably into relation. And I think it was this very, in a way, quite a subtle way of resolving the tension, which is lingering at this point, between feminists who see trans women and men as traitors and trans men and women who understand themselves as feminists.
So Jack, of course, said a million things that were really interesting, as always, and rich stuff, but some of which I would agree with and some of which I would take issue with. I do think I'm always try to be cautious about, even from the beginning, sort of the language of addiction. So when Jack was saying like TV is there to sort of seduce us, yes, in a way that's true. But I feel like the language of sort of media culture seducing us or addicting us is always itself gender coded and sexually coded. It always, you know what I mean, ties into ideas of the consuming woman, or the sexually obsessed fanatic who becomes the fan, or the emasculated queer boy. So I would always want to caution about that. But I think that the point that we're drawn in, and partially through the possibilities of temporality that Jack talked about, the temporality of TV, again, is fascinating. And I think raises both possibilities and limitations, as some of the examples given in terms of like the fascinating example of what does this mean for things like visibility, invisibility, passing specifically, because there's a way in which, again, television is always has to mark certain things as exceptional and extraordinary to get your attention, whether it's in a news story, like it's always breaking news, right, that then like they report on so many times it becomes regularized, or the sort of event of any narrative. But then that like goes on and on and on for the next week, so that there are these moments of sort of shock that can open up sort of different ways of thinking, but then they, in a way, become regularized as they go over time, so that the way that eventfulness turns into everydayness can. So it's interesting in terms of what Jack was saying about passing, that then it raises this question of it's always either a shock to see someone, or it just becomes normalized and you don't notice anymore. On the other hand, that endless temporality and seriality, I think, can do amazing things for thinking about for opening up possibilities of thinking of relationality, as Jack talked about. So for me personally, and this is maybe just me personally, I don't like transparent. I probably don't think it's a great example of what could be, because I feel like it doesn't do as much with that stuff. I mean, partially because it sticks, I think, a little bit too conventionally to sitcom form. I have a little bit of a sitcom allergy, I probably should say, but I love seriality, and I think that some other programs that make use of seriality become interestingly trans or queer, not because necessarily they have trans or queer characters, but because the narrative structure as a whole, and again, the logic of the way of thinking as a whole, opens those up. So I would think there of something like Sense8, for example, where it's not just that there's a queer character, it's that the entire structure is about trying to think about different connections, global connections, even like feeling like you're in different bodies. You sense different things, like sensory distributed sensation. That means that its structure, in a way, is trans, not just that the characters are. Or like another goofy show that I love, that I think is sort of interesting in terms of queer possibilities, would be something like The Magicians. I don't know if anybody sees it, which is like such an insane show in many ways, but there's a way in which it opens up its multiplicities to the point where, I mean, there are some queer characters, but there's also like, it's erotic goes so far beyond that. Like there's like actually shipping between a character and literally a ship, right? Like a ship on the ocean and a character are in a ship together, which is sort of, you know, there's like a romance between them, which is fascinating. And, you know, and it also opens up the possibilities of different timelines and different dimensions that makes you think about, well, what could differences be? What other narrative possibilities are out there? What if my character was in a totally different universe? There's a way in which it's itself a kind of queer temporality and queer spatiality that I think ties to the way that its characters have these very complex webs, where I would argue it's one show that's not really about family. It's about community and friendship in a way. And it shows, you know, where the sexual relations are part of the friendships, but not necessarily. Like, it just opens up what those mean. So for me, those are kind of have more possibilities. The other just possibility I want to mention is of course, you know, in today's world, there's commercial programs, and I don't think we concede the ground. I mean, we live in a consumer commodity world, unfortunately, and I think that if we dismiss things as say like, well, because they're part of a capitalist neoliberal consumer commodity world, I mean, then we're dismissing everything in our world. We still have to fight on that ground, right, and try to claim those things. But at the same time, it's also always important to look at alternatives to that, which there are always, not only through different modes of delivery and platforms like Netflix, which, yeah, it's different, it's not that different. I mean, maybe they have a different mode of financialization, but it's still financialized. But one project, for example, that I just adore for people who know it is A.J. Christian's Open TV, which, you know, he's a producer, and he works very hard to be able to help produce and raise money for independent web series, most of which focus on queer folks, trans folks, people of color. And, you know, he sets up, in a way, his own network, and he does amazing things. And I think it's great to have those alternatives out there. But one of the things I really appreciate about his work is that he insists that it's television, right? So it's open TV. It's like, he doesn't want to just say, oh, TV, bad object, and I'm moving away, and now let's go to the web, and, you know, I'm just making online video. Yes, it is online video, but he wants to insist, like, this is an intervention into television. I'm making television. And I think that we need to operate on, you know, look at different reading communities, fan communities, how you can rewrite shows, as Julia looks at, how people in the industry can do things, but also, you know, other things through other formats. And I think we need to claim all of them as the ground on which we need to operate to create a queer TV.
Yeah, I totally agree with the idea of finding narrative structures that are queer and not only characters. I think it's very interesting. I will have questions about sitcom and humor, but maybe Julia wants to add something before.
Yeah, I would just say there's so many great things brought up here. A couple things come to mind for me, especially around this question of both seriality and temporality, in that what something like, say, Amazon Prime offers, right, with something like Transparent, as well as, of course, Netflix, and are also these notoriously, these companies that don't reveal who's watching, how many people, what that audience looks like, which can actually be, I think, very interesting and thought-provoking in terms of how we can rethink this foundational idea of how we think of television, both in terms of being restricted by, consumer, both sort of thinking about how advertisers are thinking about consumers, and of course how producers are thinking about advertisers. And when you throw that model away, perhaps things can change. Of course, it's also it's an interesting model, right? I think it has its issues. The other thing about, I think, these series that do go on and tell, over different seasons, tell very different stories, is how they also challenge that kind of traditional model that, goes, of course, from May, or, goes from September to May, which this isn't entirely new, right? This model has been, even 10 years ago, they were playing with summer programming, original series on cable as a way to keep people. But there's this other piece of it that has to do with coming out a year apart, right? And so TV, which has for so long been produced so fast, and that kind of, within a month, a new episode of Law and Order airs, with a rip from the headlines, right? And how drastically different that is with this kind of model of, every June dropping the whole new 8 to 10 episodes, right, which maybe were made 2 months ago, maybe were made 8 months ago. I think that changes some of these questions of temporality a bit. And I think just in terms of maybe this question of reading, which I also think of as about literacy, and about both kind of teaching literacy, right, which is what we do in the classroom every day, but also sort of thinking about how can we encourage a kind of wider popular or public kind of conversation that I think increases literacy in ways that are really important, both for kind of keeping queer possibilities as wide as they can be, but also just in terms of, I think, giving people who are so enmeshed in this television world a bit of tools for stepping back, right, and thinking about kind of what does it mean to be literate in terms of how we think about television culture.
And I think that, there is a way, again, I think you're totally right about how the temporality of television, always incredibly complex, is now even more complex, because there's multiple temporalities going on at the same time, and some things that you feel like are immediate and other things that you wait for. And, with TV, we'll do something and then it will be reboot. And there's a way in which TV, it stops and starts, and they're not stops and starts. So it makes it even in a way more complicated. But the fact that it can use time, I mean, even though, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of Transparent, I could see from, that the clip that Jack included, it has the time to draw out these issues, and therefore to get us literally to think about, like, the relationship between the personal and the political, even as television itself as a form is always on the border of the personal and the political. It's bringing, for good or for bad. I mean, in a way, the personal and political, of course, like famous feminist slogan. But to go back to, again, Trump land, he's successful also precisely because he equates the personal with the political, and that then again makes people feel like he's quote unquote authentic. So it's when those logics are equally used against us, it means we really need to think about how can we engage and do something different with those, which might not be in the content of any of these shows, but in the discourses around them, in the communities that they create, right, with fan communities and various rewritings, with the way that they can be tied to, you know, move from televisual communities to other activist communities. So, you know, I think it's the entire formation, not the content of particular programs always. Not that those are separable either, but yeah.
I would also say Lynne's piece after the election in 2016 should be required reading on sort of why, I mean, I sent it around to literally like family members, everyone who was trying to answer this question, which was everybody at the time, right, of why did he get elected? And I think thinking about those TV logics is really important, so.
And I hate to, I mean, I don't want to be in the discourse of like, television is to blame for the horrible state of the world today. I think it's a little bit part of like that kind of we're seduced into, we're addicted logic. And I don't want to make it, you know, I feel like that's a very old, in a way, discourse of blaming the media for whatever. But so I don't want to sound, but I do want to think about the way in which we literally think through media logics without thinking about how we're thinking through media logics. And so we need to, I think, be more, as Julie was saying about literacy, aware of what those media logics are so that we don't, so that we have agency within them.
So I go back to my question about, so you say you don't like sitcom, and I kind of understand better why. No, probably because of the structure, which is traditionally very constrained. But my question was about humor. If we think television as an environment, as you seem to describe it, like a space in which all the places for discourse are possible, and the complexity allows of storylines, and the extent of a narrative allows a lot of going back or rewriting or rereading. So I was wondering, including fun rereadings, etc. I was wondering if humor, including parody, could be considered a queer tool for political action.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I do appreciate, I mean, even though it's not my favorite genre, I do appreciate that it's not only the temporality of seriality that can be interesting, it's also the temporality of repetition that can be interesting. And even the way in which, in fact, I can say something more about this maybe later about, but even the way in which repetition is tied to a kind of death drive can be interesting, not only deadening. So I do value, in a way, that you can do different things with repetition because there's always difference within repetition. It's always repetition with a difference. And so I feel like sitcom form can play with that in an interesting way, the same way that, let's say, soap opera form can differently play with extension. They're kind of, you know, and even again, if we go back to some classic sitcoms, often classic sitcoms, whether it's, you know, The Odd Couple or I Love Lucy or Laverne and Shirley, like endlessly repeated, even though the narratives of those were that these people were all heterosexual people, but the pleasure of watching week after week after week as they repeat their antics was always from like Laverne and Shirley together or Lucy and Ethel together, or so there's always these sort of, the very repetition constructs a queer couple out of something that narratively is not a queer couple, because the pleasure in watching is their moments of like, oh, once again, they're going to do some, you know, hilarious antic, right? So I do think that humor can do something. On the other hand, I also think that humor, I mean, with all of these, you know, consumer culture is, as we can appropriate anything, right? And there's a way in which televisual humor, and especially often self-reflexive humor, like we know, you know, that we know that we're doing this, it like allows audiences to kind of pat themselves on the back that they get the parody, they get the target, and they can now feel like they're part of the in-group who gets it, which itself then makes them then a marketed, a targeted demographic. So I feel like those things can very easily be reincorporated into the commodity structure. But as I was saying a minute ago, I also don't think that we can, I don't think we can have the luxury of refusing things that are commodified, or we would not be able to engage with anything in our world.
Is there one question from the audience? If not, or do you want to add something? Because we're perfect with the schedule, I would say. Oh yeah. Do we want to be perfect, or do you want to
Can
add
I say
something?
one? I was
Yes,
saying something about that one of the, Julia had before mentioned the kind of problem of the like queer baiting today, which I think is a huge problem. And one, I think, particular subset of queer baiting is the sort of what people refer to as the kill your gays trope, where like a queer character will be on a program just to try to get the queer demographic, and then they'll kill that person off. And obviously that's a problem. But there's also, I think, like in the same way that TV does these interesting things between all these other binaries, between the live and the dead too. I've been interested recently, I feel like there's a number of shows that have actually featured or been about queer deaths in a way that isn't just kill your gays, but making us think about what do these losses mean. So whether it's like Assassination of Gianni Versace or Pose or Killing Eve or Vita, they all in a way I think are almost narrating the costs of the closet itself and the way that itself can be deadening. But how also new relations and new communities can emerge from the ashes of that. So again, I feel like with all of these sort of tropes, like televisual forms that can be so entrapping, there are also ways, I think, to claim them, to play with, and some of it does have to do with who literally, is the producers behind them and what they're doing with it. The fact that Assassination of Gianni Versace and Pose were made by Nina Jacobson, for instance, a queer person in mainstream industry, means that I think that there is a way in which the queer and the mainstream can be tweaked to allow for certain things to happen. So just as I think it's really important that A.J. Christian, for instance, is making things that are outside the industry, but marketing them as TV, that Nina Jacobson is also making things inside the industry that I think can play sometimes with those narrative forms or tropes or situations differently.
Yes, yep. Thank you so much for your presentation. Because Julie mentioned your piece on Trump TV, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I haven't read
it's
it,
very silly. But thank you, Julia. But it's, yeah.
I was wondering if you could I just wanted your opinion on how politics and capital intertwined in the last week, The Good Fight. And how the clip, I don't know if you saw it.
No.
Okay.
I didn't,
so
sorry.
It's a clip that they do short musical, and a clip on China was banned, and they put CBS banned this clip on the screen. Anyway, maybe we could talk more.
Oh, fascinating.
Or,
I'd
or
love to hear
exchange-
your analysis about it.
Well, it's just I don't. It happened like 1 week ago, and I think everyone thought it was a joke when it was actually it was reality. It was the truth that CBS decided to ban this clip, and they didn't ban, for example, when Diane is looking for a search word like "kill President Trump."
Yeah.
But they banned the
Wow.
China censorship clip. And anyway, something to look up.
Yeah, that's
maybe
amazing.
we can talk it over
Yeah.
during but I think it's a great example of how politics and capital and economies are intertwined in a very interesting way in TV, in the TV medium, in the TV reality.
I mean, I'd love to know what other people think, because I think that there's some weird, I mean, a lot of people have written, I think, wonderful things about the intersection between television and like a neoliberal logic, right? Especially, like Laurie Ouellette, and the way in which, again, less about characters than the very structure itself is sort of training people to be these actors in a neoliberal economy where everybody, where everything is this sort of calculation of your own entrepreneurial self and how you're going to make you. And I do think that television is very immersed in that. But there's almost a way in which I feel like televisual logic is moving through the neoliberal to something even different, like a kind of, again, tribalism that's much less about sort of the individual economic actor than this sort of, and again, I feel like there's a way in which we're shifting to a different kind of relation between these logics and the economy and subjectivities that we don't yet have a language for to be able to fight it. So, for all the work on kind of televisual neoliberal logics and how that ties into, again, heteronormative, white, middle class, I do think that there are shifts to something maybe with possibilities, but also with terrifying possibilities in these sort of, sort of now more. So much as I would love to talk about queer communities, the fact that there are also these tribal communities emerging through the media is also alarming. So we always, I think, need to look at, I wouldn't want to say go back to the good or the bad, but look to what are productive possibilities versus ones that we really, again, need to figure out how to think about to warp. It's great to have imaginative futures, but there's certain futures we don't want to have to imagine. Right?
Julia, would you like to add something?
I guess I would just add, because I know you guys want to keep on schedule, but I would just add that I've been noticing some of these trends, right, or some patterns in terms of representation, and the ways that, of course, we're seeing undeniably, right, an increase in both kind of trans and even some sort of non-binary representations. I know you have another clip there of Jack talking about Billions and the character of Taylor. And I've thought about that in relation to the kind of resurgence of 90s shows like the sitcom Will and Grace, for example, which has been really successful since it's been brought back, and how some of that, I think, might be explained by, while television kind of pushes for this edginess, right, in this competitive landscape, that there's also this kind of desire to return to what seems to Americans now clear, right, or to audiences in general, kind of like clear, which is like this, gay identity of characters on Will and Grace, like Will and Jack, right, and even Karen, in response to this kind of complication of gender, right, that I think television likes to sort of tout itself in those progressive terms, but there's also this way in which I think we're seeing I don't know if I'd call it so much as backlash, but some degree to which there's a desire for what is clean and easy to know for people.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for joining us for this roundtable.